Pray with me. O God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable to you, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. I did the math last night, and I believe I taught my first children's Sunday school lesson approximately 33 years ago. So if I tried to do the math and figure out how many children's lessons and try-it lessons and vacation Bible school lessons I've prepared and taught, I don't think I can count that high over 33 years, but I can tell you that this story from the Gospel of John plays often. It's one of those stories that comes up a lot in the children's curriculum, and I think it's because, and part of the reason that I love it is because it's told in the style of a really good story. Right? It has a great beginning, and then it has that, it builds to the climax, and it has a very satisfying ending. It's told like a really good story. And I thought that I knew the story very well because I've been teaching it to children all these years. But as I dove a little deeper into trying to retell this story for grown-ups, I realized it got a little more complicated than I gave it credit for. So the story starts with our main character, Jesus, right, traveling in an area he's supposed to stay away from. Is he in danger? Is something going to happen to him? We can see the setting of the story in our mind. Jesus travels through the desert, stops at a well. We can even feel his thirst and hear the weariness in his voice as he stops at the hottest part of the day while the sun is at its peak in the sky. Can you feel the thirst of an ancient desert dweller? Jesus is traveling through Samaria. He's been with his disciples, traveling, preaching. He's been with John the Baptist, baptizing new converts all around the countryside, and he's had his midnight conversation with Nicodemus. Now we find him alone, which doesn't happen very often. We notice that in the Bible. Jesus doesn't travel alone terribly often. In fact, the kids and I have been talking about that a lot in Try It because we've been talking about all the stories of Jesus' mission here on earth. Just those short years that he was here and he taught us all those important lessons. And we've noticed that there's always a crowd following Jesus. And in this story, Jesus is away from the crowds. He's traveling alone, and his disciples have gone into town to find lunch. I wondered, if the disciples had been with Jesus, do you think Peter would have tried to stop him? Don't go through Samaria, Jesus, we don't do that. Do you think the disciples would have tried to barricade his way and said, no. No, we need to walk literally across the Jordan River to avoid walking through Samaria, because that's what good Jewish people do. Jewish people did not cross through Samaria, but Jesus crossed through Samaria. Jewish people and the Samaritans, we're not talking just a simple avoidance. Jewish people of the day considered Samaritans to be unclean because Samaritans had intermarried with the people of the land during their captivity. Jews were no longer allowing Samaritans to even worship in the temple in Jerusalem, so Samaritans had established their own place of practice and worship of God. But what we see early in this text, I think before noticing anything else, is perhaps a revelation of the true nature of Jesus. Jesus did not bend to conventions or social expectations. Jesus went where people needed to hear his message. Jesus entered Samaria, and he stopped at Jacob's well. If you're familiar with stories of Jacob's well was a well that generation after generation of Jews, Muslims, Christians, and Samaritans alike had all agreed was the well given to them by their ancestor Jacob in the 33rd chapter of Genesis. Experts today agree that Jacob's Well is one of the few verifiable biblical sites because it's a 135-foot deep well drilled through bedrock. It still exists today, and it's protected within the confines of an Eastern Orthodox church and monastery on the West Bank in modern-day Palestine. The well still produces clear drinking water that visitors can sample even today. So whether it was the intention of the gospel writer or not, I feel like the setting of the story here is important because it illustrates the shared heritage of all of God's children. That well came before the disparity between the Samaritans and the Jews. It was just a well filled with water for thirsty travelers. Let's talk about water. As I'm sure you can all imagine, there's a lot of talk about water at my house. But it also seemed to be really important to the writers of our ancient texts because water is mentioned 722 times in the Bible. We know, like I mentioned during the messy moment, we know how lucky we are to go to the tap and fill our water bottles, our glasses, anytime we want to with clean, available water, and I have never once worried about it running out. And that's not just because I'm married to the department director. Water is an essential element for life. Our bodies are made of roughly 60% water, and becoming dehydrated or simply not having enough water can be deadly. We need water to live. I have a coffee cup at home that reads, "No water, no coffee." So see, like it's really important, Joe. Can you imagine? We take for granted one of life's most precious and limited resources. According to the philanthropic group Water for People, 1 in 4 people worldwide still do not have access to safe, clean drinking water, and sub-Saharan women spend 40 billion hours, that's billion with a B, each year walking for water, much like the Samaritan woman in our story. And Jesus asked her for water. We read this story often, and I think maybe we fail to see the water as a character in the story. To ancient desert-dwelling people who walked for hours, if not days, to haul water from one common well, water was their most precious resource. Jesus speaks to a woman, a Samaritan woman, and asks her for a drink. She answers him, and in my imagination, and you can tell me if I'm wrong here, Pastor Nancy, in my imagination, she answers him with a bit of sass. I hear her go, "Who are you, a Jew, to ask me, a woman of Samaria, for a drink?" Like almost a, "Who are you? Why are you asking me?" And then Jesus responds with what feels like a really cryptic answer. He says, if you know who I am and where I come from, you'd be asking me for water, and I would offer you living water. An offer of living water in a world where life depended on a limited access to water. Jesus knew he had the woman's attention, even if she did not understand what the offer was quite yet. I can't help but think that any other woman of her day may have cowered or obeyed, maybe gone to get an uncle or a brother, a husband, to deal with this stranger that's bothering her at the well. But our Samaritan woman does not do that. She looks at Jesus and she says, "Sir, this is a deep well and you have no bucket. Where are you going to get living water from? Are you better than our ancestor Jacob?" Jesus tells the woman that whoever drinks from this well will only be thirsty again, but that he has something better to offer. Water that gushes from a well of eternal life, and those who drink from it will never be thirsty again. She still misunderstands. I love this part. I love realizing that in the story, because how often do we misunderstand? How often are we taught the same lesson or given the same offers, and we're just not getting it. We're not understanding. Our woman in the story hears a promise of never-ending water, never being thirsty, no more miles and miles trudging to and from a well carrying heavy water jars. How does Jesus make her understand? He tells her to go get her husband. I always thought that part of the story was a little unusual. It's a part of the story where we often get sidetracked by the details of this woman's past. I don't have a husband, she says. And Jesus answers her, that's true. You've had 5 husbands, and the man you currently live with is not your husband. I want us to take note, though, that even in any of the translations I researched, Jesus does not condemn the woman in this passage. He doesn't condemn her for her many marriages or even her current living situation. He merely acknowledges it. Why? Because he needs her to know that he knows her. He needs her to see who he is. Jesus needs the woman to understand that he knows details about her no stranger could know. He needs her to recognize him. As Jesus tells the woman that the day has come for everyone to hear the word and seek salvation and worship God in spirit and truth, we can only imagine her head is spinning as her heart is beginning to grasp the truth. As she tells Jesus, she says to Jesus, I know the teachings. I know there's a Messiah coming, and when that Messiah comes, he will teach us everything. And Jesus just looked at her and said, that's me. He said, I am. I am the one. See that woman with me this morning. Picture her in your mind. Our woman at the well was not a young woman in the prime of her life. Jesus knows she's had 5 husbands. She's living with a man she's not married to. So we can assume she has seen the death of loved ones. She's probably buried husbands. Perhaps she's been left, abandoned. She walks for miles to fill water jugs, burdened with memories and sadness and the hardships of life. We can imagine that she's parched to her very soul. And then she meets Jesus. What's hard in your life? What burdens and sadness and regret do you carry with you that drain you to your very soul? Is your heart heavy with worry? Are you hanging on to hurt, regret? Come and meet Jesus. He's waiting at the well for us. Like the well of our ancestors, it still hasn't run dry, neither does the well of love that Jesus offers to us. Come to that well. Allow yourself to be filled with the grace and love of Jesus. Because let's face it together, other sources we've tried have run dry. From other people and relationships, to work, careers, even trips to the refrigerator. We tend to seek fulfillment like seeking water from an empty bucket. Jesus calls us to the well. Like the woman at the well, we may misunderstand. We've become so used to being thirsty or quenching our thirst temporarily only to be thirsty again that we lose heart over constantly feeling needy. Kim Coleman Healy writes in her book, From Beholding to Becoming, when our thirst recurs, we doubt the reality of our faith. If you don't feel close to God, Guess who moved? Jesus' promise, whoever drinks the water I give will never be thirsty, is not a test. He wears away our distrust, like water dripping on limestone. He frees us from thirst, not by ending our need of water, but by never running dry. Jesus calls us to the well to be filled. The Samaritan woman filled her soul with the very presence of Jesus until the revelation was so much that it bubbled up and overflowed, and she had to share it with others. She went back to her village and told the people there what she had witnessed, and John 39 tells us that many Samaritans in that city believed in Jesus because of the woman's word when she testified. Our neighbors are thirsty. Our world is filled with those who need what only the love of Jesus can offer. I don't know if I mentioned when I started speaking this morning that the recording of this sermon today is going to be submitted and graded and picked apart by my classmates in License to Preach. And so I don't know if this is breaking a rule about getting too personal or sharing too much information, but I would be remiss if in this lesson this week I didn't acknowledge the desert that I have been walking through. The desert my family has been walking in for all these months. And that you, my church family, have been my well. The cards, the beautiful messages, the calls, the texts, the food, the visits, the hugs, the flowers have been drops of nourishing grace and mercy for my soul. You have been the love of Jesus my family needed. So what does that mean for us, for the rest of us? People are hurting. People are experiencing loss. People are lonely. People are hurting, thirsty, parched. And the best thing we can do is show them that Jesus is walking with them by walking with them ourselves. Don't leave them alone in the desert. Bring them into community. And be the well of Jesus' love in very real ways. Maybe we need to take a walk through Samaria, somewhere we wouldn't normally travel. Is Jesus calling you to cast aside expectations and do his will? Are the people of his church called to disregard convention and take action in places and circumstances we've been avoiding? In places where people are hurting, hungry, in need of Jesus. Jesus calls us to be filled to overflowing that we might pour his love into our friends and neighbors. Jesus didn't offer living coffee or fruit, or cookies. He offered an essential element of life itself, water. The waters of life, of birth, the waters of baptism, life-giving, life-changing water. Jesus calls us to be filled with the essential and life-changing power of his love until we overflow and fill it and share it with others. Where are you in this story? Have you met Jesus at the well? You find yourself ready to share the life-giving message with others? Have you felt the presence of Jesus and you just can't wait to share it? Or are you walking through your own Samaria? Lost, parched, in need of a drink? Come to the well and find the power of the living water that Jesus is pouring out for us all. Come to the well. Bring others to the well. Be filled with the love of Jesus that runs through like a river in our soul. Thanks be